Okay. Okay, before we start, I really want to say it was Brenda's idea, a very good idea, that many of you who come here often and for a long time, one of the people who was a regular here, though many times she couldn't because of different medical problems, was Esther Root from Denmark. And she is scheduled for a major operation this Wednesday. So Brenda reminded me, and I'm very glad that she did. So we're going to dedicate our learning for a refuah shalema, a successful operation, and hopefully, Esther Root, you will come through it with flying colors, and it will lead to a whole new healthy chapter in your life. At the end of the class, we'll take a minute or two to actually say a prayer together. Maybe by then she'll even be online, which would be very, very nice if that would happen. If not, we're going to try to get word to her that we did pray for her. Okay. Welcome, everyone, to Journeys to the Books of the Prophets. We have finished the second book of Shmuel, Shmuel Bet. And last week we began, we're going to continue this week, and perhaps even until next week, where we are looking at the bigger picture of David HaMelech, King David, who he was, where his soul was coming from, the different challenges he had. We dealt with all of this within the events of Shmuel Bet, but now we're trying to kind of reframe them in a deeper picture of the great soul that was David HaMelech. So last week we went through many things. I'm going to do a quick review, which will lead us into the first idea of tonight. And we discussed from the Arizal, where he says that when Adam ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil, all subsequent souls that would ever be born were coming from Adam and Chava, Adam and Eve. And the Arizal, when he talks about reincarnation, he traces everyone back to either Cain or Abel and back to Adam. And it would be very typical in one of his discussions of a particular soul to say he came from the right arm of Adam Arishon. He came from the left arm. He came from the mouth. He came from the eyes. However, the Ari, who had divine inspiration, understood these things. And he said that David HaMelech was among the souls that fell the lowest. When Adam sinned, he was expelled from the garden. So different sparks of his soul, as it were, fell to different levels. The soul of David, according to the Arizal, fell to the lowest level. And this is so important to understand who David HaMelech was, because he was very challenged his whole life. He had test after test, and there's a verse that says, Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'Kam. 7 times a righteous person falls, but they get up. And that was David HaMelech. David HaMelech did a number of things that were not correct. He had many attributes that were in need of fixing. But when we consider, and we talked about this, that why didn't God, as it were, give up on David? Because he understood where he was coming from and how many rectifications he did do, coming from such a, as it were, low place. And if you remember, we went through the different couples that eventually gave birth to the line of David and eventually to Mashiach. And all of them were mired in question, strange circumstances. We're not going to go back over that, but Yehuda and Tamar, Lot and his daughters, Boaz and Ruth, and even David's own birth, which we discussed. Again, if anyone missed any of this, all of these are archived on Telegram. They're all available on YouTube and our website. Anyone who wants to go back over any of the classes. And then we discussed that it was on the 24th of Elul when David went up on the roof and he sees a beautiful woman bathing who is Bathsheba, and thus begins the whole episode of David and Bathsheba, which in a certain way plagued David for the rest of his life. He did tshuva for the rest of his life for that whole incident, even though the sages, and we discussed this in great detail, that the story isn't exactly what it appears in the English translation of the book of Shmuel, that apparently what he did wrong wasn't the conclusion we would come to, which was adultery. And we see that it wasn't adultery, but there was something not rectified about the whole situation. According to the sages, Bathsheba was officially divorced at the time, but still, David did not act in the best way, and he knew it, and he admitted it, and he did tshuva for the rest of his life. And that was on the 24th of Elul, and we learned that creation begins on the 25th of Elul. But the whole week before, symbolically, is the creation of the world of Tohu. This is the world of great lights, but vessels that could not hold those lights, and they shattered. Shvirata Kelim. And each day from the 18th of Elul represents a different sphera that broke during those 7 days. The last day was the 24th of Elul, and that was Malchut of the world of Tohu. And of course, Malchut means kingship. David is the epitome of kingship, but it was in an unrectified way, the world of Tohu. So that's where we want to begin tonight, because this tells us a lot about the soul of David HaMelech, is that his soul is sourced in the world of Tohu. And the lights were tremendous, positive, for the good. But the Kalim could not hold it. The Kalim could not hold these great lights. And so this is really the story of David HaMelech. He had such incredible energy, good intentions. He united Israel, and we're going to go through his influence. But it was from the world of Tohu. So his whole life, he's trying to create vessels that could hold this tremendous light that he had. Most of the time he succeeded tremendously, and sometimes he didn't. He had difficulties. But this is just a very, very important understanding of the nature of David HaMelech's soul, where it's coming from, the potential it had, and also the challenges and the obstacles. Now we know, we've discussed many times, that the Lubavitcher Rebbe, the last Lubavitcher Rebbe, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, alav shalom. So when discussing how to bring the Mashiach, so he said, what we need to do is take the lights of Tohu and put them in rectified vessels. That is the challenge of every person. and of all of Am Yisrael. We need these tremendous lights, but we have to have fitting vessels for them. And that is, according to the Lubavitcher, that is what will bring Mashiach. We have to draw these great lights, but we have to work on ourselves very hard to make proper vessels. This is the story of David HaMelech, his whole life. His soul was shining with these tremendous lights, but he had challenges, obstacles of how to channel and direct that energy properly. Now, there's a concept in Kabbalah, because we know we have 4 spiritual worlds, even a 5th spiritual world, and the Malchut, meaning the lowest level of one world, becomes the highest level of the next world. So David HaMelech, he was part of the breaking of the vessels, and that was in Malchut. But those broken vessels became wedged in the highest level of this world, Olam HaTikun. And that's why David becomes king, and his kingship lasts forever until Mashiach ben David. And also, if Malchut of a higher world becomes the Keter, the crown of the next world, well, who wears the crown? The king. So the highest level is always connected to the lowest level within a world. And then within worlds, the lowest level becomes the highest level for the next world. And this hints to this idea of a Baal Tshuva. And we have a state.
I just read the chat.
Yeah, sorry, I was muted. We'll say it again. This idea of Malchut, of one world being connected to the Keter of the next world, is hinting that the lowest level of one world becomes the highest level of the next world. This is the secret of inter-inclusion. And so David HaMelech, he is is everyone hearing me? Yeah, okay. Sean, everyone's hearing me now. This hints to what's called a Baal Tshuva, someone who either was not connected to Jewish tradition and then returns, or someone who's born into it and leaves it but comes back. Oh, I see, the recording. Okay, I'm sorry, yes. Okay, thank you, Sean, and Dara for letting me know. Really sorry about this Wi-Fi connection. It just kind of makes everything more complicated. Okay. I wasn't recording, so I want to record this again. We're saying that the Malchut of one world becomes the Keter of the lower world. And this hints to this idea of a Baal Tshuva, someone who falls, but then returns stronger than ever and becomes, so the Malchut, which is the lowest level, becomes the highest level of the next world. And that's what the sages say, in the place that a Baal Tshuva stands, even a complete righteous person can't stand. And David HaMelech is the epitome of a Baal Tshuva because of what happened with Bathsheba. And that's why the sages say, how could this have happened? How could David, it wasn't fitting for him. How did it happen? And they answer in a mysterious way that in a certain way it was somewhat orchestrated, that this would happen in order that David could show every individual how to do tshuva. And we see that in the Psalms. That we'll get to in a separate idea about the Psalms. Okay, continuing. So this is something that Sean pointed out a number of times, and we've discussed it, but I'm just going to bring it up again with a new point, that the Arizal says that the three letters of the name Adam, Aleph, Daled, Mem, stands for Adam, David, Mashiach. And the idea that David is in the middle of history, this concept that David is in the middle of history. And we saw that he's born in 2854 of the Jewish year. If that's the middle, you double it, it comes out to 5708, which is 1948. So in a certain way, the redemptive process that will bring eventually the Mashiach began in 1948 with the birth of the state of Israel, even though the state of Israel has a lot of rectifications still to do. And then if you take how old he was when he began to rule in Jerusalem, he was 37. So if you add 37 to 2854, you get 2891. When you double that, it brings us to 5782, only 3 years ago. But that's when David only began to rule. So all of these years from the start of the state of Israel till now, and really for the next 40, 50 years, is all part of the middle of history. So this is something we went over. I did that very quickly because I just want to add a point here. If we're saying that David is in the middle of history, and we have all of these numbers, and they work really well because everyone agrees that we're in a redemptive process right now. The only thing is we don't know how to finish it, how long it will take, and exactly what has to happen. But it's unmistakable from all of the prophecies of the great prophets that we are very deep into a redemptive process. So it's not just that David is in the middle of history as far as years, but on a spiritual level, what it's teaching us, the idea of the middle in Hebrew sometimes is called the pnimiyut, the inner essence, the most important part. And so David represents, again, he wasn't perfect. No one in the Bible is perfect. But David, with all of his positive qualities, all of the great things that he did, and we're going to spend probably this class and well into the next class to really see what was the influence of David. So that we really haven't gone to. But here I just want to point out that the idea of being in the middle of history is also saying the inner point of history is David. And that's why he was blessed for an eternal kingship all the way through Mashiach. Mashiach ben David. Mashiach will come from David. And we learned that even from Adam, that Adam donated 70 years of his life so David would have time in this world. Okay, so moving on, I want to mention, just one second. I want to mention that once a month, we do Kiddush Levana. We sanctify the moon. This happens every month, according to Ashkenaz, from the 3rd of the month till the full moon. According to Hasidim, Sfardim, it's from the 7th of the month, the Hebrew month, till the full moon. We do a relatively short ceremony called Kiddush Levana, sanctifying the moon. There's a beautiful bracha in the beginning, and we say all kinds of verses. But one of the things that we say is David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam. Everyone knows this, the song. There are many nigunim to David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam. And it's right in the middle of Kiddush Levana. So what's the connection? What is David doing in Kiddush Levana? So we're told that the moon represents Israel. And it represents Israel because it waxes and wanes. And this is the dynamic of exile and redemption. All of Jewish history is kind of a constant cycle of exile and then redemption, exile, redemption, exile, redemption in the bigger picture, but also just in the book of Judges, which we learned together. There were many times that enemies overran Israel. Israel cries out to Hashem. Hashem sends a redeemer, a judge, and leads to salvation, leads to redemption. So in the big picture, going down to Egypt, taken down to Babylonia, taken into Rome, the big exiles and redemptions, but also smaller ones throughout Jewish history. And that's represented by the moon. And the person who represents the moon more than anyone is David. First of all, the moon is always connected to Malchut. Because Malchut, even though we say kingship, and most people think of masculine, Malchut is considered a feminine sphera. And the whole idea of Malchut, again, we're not talking about male bodies and female bodies. We're talking about energies. And a bit paradoxically, the idea of kingship, of Malchut, is a feminine concept. So many nigunim for David Melech Yisrael Chai v'Kayam. I merited to be with Reb Shlomo when he made up one of the more famous ones. David Melech, Melech Yisrael, David Melech, Melech Yisrael, David Melech, Melech Yisrael, Melech Yisrael, Chai v'Kayam. And then we say Shalom Aleichem, Aleichem Shalom, and then we say Siman Tov, Mazel Tov, Yehei Lanu, L'Kol Yisrael, Amen. So that's the second part of the song. Ay Simman Simman Tov, Mazel Mazel Tov, Yehei Lanu L'Kol Yisrael, Amen. But there are many other nigunim also, but that in the last 25 years has been one of the more famous ones. So this is a very deep connection of David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam with the idea of the moon and the idea that even when the moon wanes, it will wax again. No matter how many times we fall, remember Sheva Yipol Tzadik V'Kam, 7 times that Tzadik falls and gets up. And then towards the end of Kiddush Levana, so David is mentioned again. Right at the end, it says, V'kayem banu mikra shekatuv. And we're asking that the saying that is spoken about should be fulfilled. What does it say? Ubikshu et Hashem Elohehem ve'et David malkam amen. That they, meaning at the time of redemption, they will seek out God, their God, and their king, David. So this is, of course, alluding to the Mashiach, that Mashiach ben David. So here in Kiddush Levana, David plays a major part because he really represents this whole idea of kingship. And the whole idea, the exile is the kingship of Israel is in exile. And the redemption is going to come through kingship, through David. So that's a little bit just about David and Kiddush Levana. Another idea that we discussed before, but here we're trying to put, let's say, all of the pieces together, is, and I'm going to do this very, very quickly, that when Avram wants to buy the burial place for Sarah, he buys Marata Machpelah for 400 pieces of silver. This number 400, as we're going to see, repeats itself and all the way to David. So he buys it for 400 pieces of silver. We're told that the word for silver, kesef, leads the Zohar to say that in the world to come, there are 400 worlds of divine pleasure that a person will inherit. And this is connected to the whole idea of Hebron and why it's such a big thing that all of our patriarchs and matriarchs, other than Rachel, are buried in Hebron, because Hebron is from the word chibur, connection. And Hebron is considered the connection between this world and the world to come. Sarah is the first Jew who dies, and she makes the connection. And Avram picks up on it between this world and the world to come. Then the sages say he bought this cave. It was the first acquisition that Avram made in the Holy Land for 400 pieces of silver. Then the sages say, well, what are the dimensions of Eretz Yisrael? They said 400 parsang by 400 parsang. A parsang, I can't remember exactly, it's more than a kilometer, but the space of Eretz Yisrael, the bigger borders are 400 by 400. Then Yaakov, he goes outside of Israel. He marries Rachel and Leah and Bilhah and Zilpah. He has all of his children who will become the tribes of Israel. Now he's coming back to Israel after 20 years. And he sends word to his brother Esav, who when he left wanted to kill him. And the Torah tells us that Esav is coming with 400 men. And Yaakov felt they're coming to keep him out of Eretz Yisrael, which has the dimensions of 400 by 400. That's the significance of the 400 men. In short, Yaakov fights with the angel. He defeats the angel of Esav. It's more complicated than that, but that's the simple understanding. And the next day when he meets Esav, Esav doesn't try to kill him, even though one midrash says he did, but basically they made peace. Esav went his way and Yaakov returned to Eretz Yisrael. But the 400 men disappear. There's no more mention of them. And so I heard this from Rav Ginsburg. These 400 men of Esav, they reappear, if you remember, when David was anointed in private, in secret by Shmuel. And then, even though Shaul didn't know this, but he began to intuit that David was a threat to him. So Shaul was chasing him, and David was hiding out. And it says that 400 men became attached to David. 400 men who had a hard time finding their place became attached to David, and they became his core group. So Rav Ginsburg said that these 400 men of Esav, because it said that David is described as being a gingy, a redhead. And we know that Esav is called Edom because he was a gingy, had red hair. And that David in many ways is a tikkun, a rectification of Esav. So the 400 men who began with Esav to try to keep Yaakov out of the land that's 400 by 400, they become, as it were, transmuted into the souls of these 400 men who are now the core group of David. So this is just a beautiful, incredible idea. Anyone who has Orchard of Delights, if you go to Parshat Vayishlach, you could see the more fuller version. And even in numerical value, numerical gems. We did a whole numerical gems about the number 400. All of these are available on YouTube. Now, I want to discuss shortly the connection between David and Hoshana Rabbah. You know that Rosh Hashanah is 2 weeks from tomorrow night, believe it or not. It's coming quicker than we can imagine. And that starts Hoshana, Yom Kippur, Sukkot, Hoshana Rabbah, and then Shmini Atzeret, Simchas Torah. So what's the connection of David to Hoshana Rabbah? During Sukkot, everyone knows we shake the 4 species, the Arba Minim. And in Beit Knesset, we make one circuit, one hakafa each day with the Arba Minim. Everyone goes around the bima, because in ancient times we would go around the altar one time every day of Sukkot, except Shabbat. Except Hoshana Rabbah, we go around 7 times. We go around 7 times. And Hoshana Rabbah, the davening on Hoshana Rabbah is out of this world. It has a lot of the same nusach of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. Many people wear their kittel that they wear in Yom Kippur, a very long davening. And as we go around 7 times, all kinds of prayers. And then after the 7 times, I'm getting to the connection of David. So we see a lot more prayers, very intense, because we're getting to the end of the holiday season. So everyone's getting in their last prayers. And we're taught that even though there is a initial sealing of the judgment on Yom Kippur at Ne'ilah. Ne'ilah means the closing of the gates. And we're told that's the end of the period, the 10 days of Tshuva, Aseret Yemei Tshuva, and that's the end of the judgment. But going all the way back to the Nevi'im Harishonim, the first prophets, said, really, the judgment is not over until Hoshana Rabbah. And that's why the davening on Hoshana Rabbah is so incredible and intense. So anyways, after the 7 circuits, many more prayers, we put down the Arba meaning and we pick up 5 willows. Now this is where David comes in, because we're told of the 4 species. The hadas, we take 3 hadas, 3 myrtle branches. That stands for Avram, Yitzhak, and Yaakov. We take 2 willows, that's Moshe and Aaron. The lulav is Yosef, and the etrog, the heart, is David. But there's also an idea that of the 4 meaning, the willows represent the least righteous of all of them. They represent a Jew who doesn't have learning Torah and doesn't have mitzvot. But here we put down the Arba meaning, we pick up 5 willows. And here the 5 willows represent David. And at the end of the last prayer, which is very messianic, one of the most messianic prayers of the entire year, is this last prayer of Hoshana Rabbah. And then in Kaddish, we take the 5 willows and we hit them on the ground 5 times. And that represents the final judgment. But right before that final judgment is this incredible messianic prayer. And so we're told that this is where David HaMelech comes in, because David is, in a sense, represents Malchut. And we know that the inner dimension of Malchut is Shiflut, is lowliness. And if you remember, we learned with the whole story when David dances the Holy Ark up to Jerusalem with wild abandon, and his wife was very critical of David. And he says to her, V'hayiti shafel be'enai, whatever it looked like to you, in my own heart and mind, I was very lowly before God. And that is the essence of David HaMelech, was this idea of shiflut. And so taking these 5 willows and hitting them on the ground 5 times, this is the energy of, in a certain way, bringing Mashiach, of this kind of shiflut. That kingship is the essence of shiflut. So now that we're talking about it, let's look at the name David. Daled Vav Daled. David, it means Dodi, my beloved. For those who are here at the beginning, we played a song, Ani L'Dodi, L'Dodi Li. I am to my beloved is to me. Dodi, Dod, is Daled Vav Daled, is really David. Dodi means my beloved. So this explains the relationship between God and David. As we said before, right after David admits that he had sinned in the whole episode of Bathsheba, immediately the next verse is that God forgave him. So remember, we learned so quickly, even though we know that David did tshuva the rest of his life, and we'll discuss that more next week. But why did God forgive him so quickly? So first we could say he saw how sincere David was, and he saw how much he took it to heart. But in another way, because God knew where his soul was coming from and appreciated how many rectifications David did to lift himself from the place he was coming from, that he was God's beloved. And this is really critical to understand the soul of David and his relationship with God. And you see it in the Psalms all the time, is David's relationship with God was so intimate. And that is because God really loved David. If you remember, in the entire Bible, there's no one that it's explicit how so many people loved him. It says explicitly that Shaul loved David. His son, Yonatan, loved David, again, explicitly. His daughter, Michal, his first wife, loved David. There's a verse that said that all of Israel loved David. And here we see how much God loved David. And the turning point was when David says to the prophet, I live in this palace, and God, as it were, is resting in a tent. We have to build a temple for God, a permanent place for God. And God says to the prophet, from the time that I took Israel out of Egypt and they built a Mishkan, no one has ever expressed that God should have a permanent place in this world. And that's when God promised that David's lineage, his descendants, would be the kings. That's how much God loved David. And so here we see it in his name, Daled Vav Daled Dod Dodi. The Daled is connected to shiflut, to lowliness, because Daled, it means adore, delet, but in Aramaic it means delate. It has nothing of its own. And that's why anytime we talk about the Sfirot, we say that all of the Sfirot flow into Malchut. And Malchut, as it were, has nothing of its own. It is the receptacle, it is the vessel of everything above it. All of the Sfirot flow into Malchut, and then Malchut organizes, arranges, fixes, directs, refines, improves everything flowing into it. But initially, it has nothing of its own. And that's represented by the letter Daled. So David's name begins with a Daled and ends with a Daled. Delate ba, it has nothing of its own. Okay, now we are going to begin a string of influences that David had. Here we've been talking very much about the soul of David and how it relates to many different things. Hoshana Rabbah, Kiddush Levana, David Melech Yisrael Chai V'Kayam, Olam HaTohu, all the different things that we went through. Now we want to look at, and we're going to start now, but we're going to go into next week, and hopefully we will finish it next week. But what was the influence that David had on the Jewish people, on Torah, Jewish tradition, and Jewish history? Here like I said, we've been dealing with David, the person, but what was his legacy? How does that affect us? So I have a list here. They're not in any particular order. So we're going to start. Just the way I thought of it. So the first one is that a very, very famous and now very influential, it's really a breita called Perek Shira, the song, a chapter of song. This is where 70 different creations voice or sing a verse, almost all of them from the Tanakh, a few from later revealed by the sages. This it was fairly hidden for many, many centuries. Not that no one knew about it, but it wasn't that known. But today, Perek Shira is very, very popular. Many, many people say it daily. My wife says it all the time for years now. Years, says it almost every day, the whole thing. And it's just very, very beautiful. The 70 different creations or creatures, from the inanimate to the vegetable to the animal, not the human, because there are 4 different opinions who's singing these verses, and one of them is human beings. But the point is, according to tradition, it was composed by David HaMelech. And we could see it because when you go to the Psalms, you see where David is telling the sun and the moon and the stars to praise God. And he talks about rivers clapping hands and mountains rejoicing and trees singing and animals dancing. Sounds very whimsical, but on a deeper level, he was connected to the idea that every creation has a spark of life from the Creator. Even the inanimate, everything has a spark of life. This is the main point of my book, Life, Soul, and Consciousness Within All of Creation. Everyone is welcome to go to Amazon and get this book. It's really an amazing book, showing not just by Jewish tradition, but scientifically, zoology, biology, how all of creation has a spark of life and soul and consciousness on very different levels. So David HaMelech is the composer of Perek Shira. Most likely over the generations, it was edited to the versions that we have today. But according to tradition, he composed Perek Shira. And again, you could see in the Psalms very clearly how that's true. If you remember when Yonatan is killed in battle, and when David finds out, he eulogizes Yonatan. And in Shmuel Bet, it's called the Kina. It's called in English, a kina. It's a mournful poem. And we went over this, but when you read it, you see where a lament, thank you, a lament. You see that on Tisha B'Av, we say kinot. During the day, sitting on the floor, we say a whole series of what are called kinot, these very mournful, sad, very graphic descriptions of the destruction of the temple and exile and some very terrible things, that happened to the Jewish people. But if you look at the first one that's called the Kina, it's from David. And if you read that, you see that he set the tone for all subsequent kinot. Other than the one of David, the one that's considered the oldest, and we say it on Tisha B'Av, is from Jeremiah, Yirmiyahu. And we have the exact words that he wrote 2,500 years ago. But here we have the words that David eulogized Yonatan in the form of a kina. And so he set the standard of a kina. The same thing with Psalms. We're going to get into Psalms more fundamentally. But I'm going to save some of this, that according to the Talmud, there's actually 10 composers of Psalms in the book of Psalms. Many, many people think they're all from David. Well, that's not true, because many of them say it's from the sons of Korach or Asaph. And then there are many other ones. Moshe wrote some of the Psalms, Avraham, and there are 10 altogether. But David set the standard for all of the Psalms, even though Moshe comes before David. But still, it's David who put together the book of Psalms. And the major themes that are running through the Psalms, like I said, Moshe comes before David, and so does Avram. So of course he learned from them, but he was the one who put together the book of Psalms that we say until this day. So the next one is one of the most fundamental, and I think we'll end with this tonight, and that is music and joy. Before David, we know that there are 10 archetypal songs sung throughout creation. Most of them actually preceded David. In the Torah itself, there's a song of the sea, there's Ha'azinu, there is the song of the well. Before the song of Yeshua, when he stopped the sun, Devorah, Chana. So David was not the first one to sing to God. But as far as a life of singing to God, that is what David initiated. David said, "Va'ani tefillah," I am prayer. And we've learned many times that the numerical value of prayer, tefillah, equals 515, equals shirah, equals song. So when David says, I am prayer, it's also saying, I am song. And we're told in the Gemara that David would sleep early in the evening. He'd wake up, a north wind would blow through his harp and make his strings vibrate and wake him up. And David would be up the rest of the night composing the Psalms, praying, learning. And to this day, there are people who still follow this called lifestyle, especially in Breslov. There are many Breslovers who do exactly that. They sleep in the early evening. They get up at midnight. They're up all night learning, doing hitbodedut, go to the mikvah right before dawn, pray as the sun comes up, learn a little bit, and then they go to sleep for a few hours, and then they go about their day. And this is really started by David. David is called Na'im Zmirot Yisrael, the sweet singer of Israel. And that epitomizes David, along with him being king, being one of the greatest warriors, one of the greatest leaders in Jewish history. He was a musician. He was a poet. Na'im Zemirot Yisrael. He was the sweet singer of Israel. This had a tremendous influence on all of Jewish history. Like I said, he wasn't the first one to sing a song to God, but in a certain way, he was the first to make music and joy the centerpiece of his service of God, and left the legacy of Perek Shira, of the Psalms, and the whole story of him dancing the ark up to Jerusalem. These are archetypal stories. It's not a one-time story that David happened to dance the ark up to Jerusalem. It had a influence. It had what's called a roshem. It left its mark on Jewish consciousness for all time. And the same thing with joy. Now we'll see in the Psalms that David expressed the highest elevated feelings of joy, but also the lowest feelings of despondency, of feeling rejected, of feeling abandoned. He was able to do both, and we've analyzed his life and why that is true. But this thing of music, this is one of the main influences that David had to this day. And we know that in the temple had music every day. And in fact, when people came to the temple, that was in a certain way the climactic moments of being in the temple was to hear the Levites singing. These were really high moments of transcendent consciousness. And David is very responsible. We know in the Psalms he wrote 15 Shir Hamalot, 15 songs of ascent. His son built the temple, but in the temple, there were 15 stairs between two parts of the temple. And those correspond to the 15 songs of ascent. So David's influence permeates all of Jewish history. And we will continue next week with this idea of the influence of David. Welcome everyone to Insights into the Haftorah. This week's coming parsha is Ki Tavo, and the Haftarah is from Isaiah, the 60th chapter, from the first verse to the 22nd verse. A relatively long Haftarah. As we've mentioned, that this is part of the 7 Haftarahs between Tisha B'Av, right after Tisha B'Av, all the way up to Rosh Hashanah. This is the 6th in the series, so that tells us we're getting very close to Rosh Hashanah. After this, there will only be one more. In this Haftarah, like all of the Haftarahs, really every week, and we know that the Haftarah on a regular week is always connected to some element or theme in the Torah portion, except these 7 have their own theme of consolation. So they're not connected to the parsha. But in every one of these that we've been dealing with, we've been learning the Haftarah for the whole year. We're getting towards the end. In every Haftarah, there's going to be a number of what we'll call famous verses or famous ideas that will come from that reading. So this is no exception. So I'm going to go through some of these ideas. But the main theme that runs through this particular Haftarah is the idea that when Mashiach comes, all of the nations of the world in a certain way will gather and will bring gifts to Israel. That, in other words, Israel, who is oppressed by all of the nations of the world for literally thousands of years, Isaiah waxes poetic about how all of the riches of all of the nations will flow back to Israel at the time of redemption. That's the main theme. And he gets into it in very, very beautiful poetry. But as far as individual verses and ideas, so we've learned already that the beloved song, Lecha Dodi, that we greet the Shabbat bride every Friday night at the beginning of Shabbat, Kabbalat Shabbat, Lecha Dodi. Here we have the word Dodi. Again, David. Come, my beloved, let us greet the bride, the Shabbos bride. And we learned that in some of these during these 7 weeks, many of the stanzas are based on verses in Isaiah in these Haftarahs. So here again, we have right at the beginning, it says, Kumi Ori, Ki Ba Orech. Arise, shine, for your light has arrived. So the composer of Lecha Dodi took these words and he wove them into one of the stanzas of Lecha Dodi. So really, Lecha Dodi is mostly influenced by verses from Isaiah. So that's right at the beginning of the Haftarah, right in the first verse. Now, we have an idea given over by Isaiah, and it's really quoted. If you could get down into just a few words, what is the national mission of the Jewish people? So we could say the Shema. We could say it's to teach the world about one God. Isaiah put it in 2 words, and it's quoted widely, that our mission is to be a light unto the nations, or goyim, a light to the nations. Here, it doesn't say that exactly, but basically says the same thing. It says, like this, the second and third verse, for behold, darkness shall cover the earth, and dense cloud the kingdoms. but upon you shall God shine, and his glory shall be seen upon you. Nations will go by your light, and kings by the brightness of your shine. So this is a little bit more poetic, but in a different place, Isaiah got it down to two words: a light unto the nations. And this is really following up on that idea. And then in the 5th verse, it says something very, very interesting. It says, then you shall see and be radiant, and expansive shall be your heart. For the affluence of the West shall be turned over to you, and the wealth of nations shall come to you. And it says specifically about the West, which is interesting in our day, where we talk about the Western world. We talk about the Judeo-Christian ethic. We talk about the Western world and democracies, and Israel is considered part of today what would be called the Western world, the democracies in the world. So it's very interesting that here he says that all of the wealth of the West will come to you. Then, if we go further, again, I'm just picking out very important verses here. But again, the theme that follows this whole thing is that after all of the oppression, in the end, all the goodness of the world will be showered upon you. Then in the 14th verse, so it says, V'karu lach ir Hashem Tzion, Kadosh Yisrael, and you will be called the city of God, Sion, the Holy One of Israel. So here we see this idea of Sion is not the only place. It's not the only place, but it doesn't appear that many times that Jerusalem and Sion are connected, almost synonymous with each other. And of course, from this comes Zionism. But here is one of the sources, again, not the only one, but one of the sources that identifies Jerusalem as Sion, as Sion. And then listen to this one. This is Yud Chet. I'll read it in English first, and then we'll see the importance in Hebrew. The 18th verse, it says, no longer shall violence be heard in your land, nor plunder and breakage in your borders, but you shall call God's salvation your protective walls, and his praise your gateways. So the word in Hebrew for destruction, where it says no longer shall violence be heard in your land. In Hebrew, it's lo yishma od Hamas ba'artzech. You won't have Hamas in your land anymore. I don't have to elaborate the significance of Hamas appearing here in Isaiah and saying that when Mashiach comes, there will be no more Hamas in your land. So we have to pray that we see that very, very quickly. Then it says like this, right after the verse that I read in the 19th, it says, you shall no longer have need of the sun for light of day, nor for brightness the moon to illuminate for you. Rather, Hashem shall be unto you an eternal light, and your God for your glory. Never again shall your sun set, nor shall your moon be withdrawn. For Hashem shall be unto you an eternal light, and ended shall be the days of your mourning. Again, very symbolic language. The reason I'm mentioning this is tonight in Israel, there's a full eclipse of the moon. The earth will be between the sun and the moon, and it's going to be full. And I'll actually mention it later what time I have to leave, because I'm determined to see this. But it's just interesting. In this Haftarah, it's talking about the sun and the moon, and tonight is a full eclipse of the moon here in Israel. Then at the end, there's two really important ones. And one says like this, V'amech kulam tzadikim, and your people, they are all righteous. Le'olam yirshu aretz, they will inherit the land forever. One second. Netzer meta'ai maseh yedei lihitpa'er. They are a branch of my planting, my handiwork through which I am glorified. Now, the reason why that verse is so important is because in Pirkei Avot, there's 6 chapters to Pirkei Avot, Ethics of the Fathers. This verse is read between each of the chapters, this very verse. And all your people are righteous, and they will inherit the land forever. They are a branch of my planting, and for me to glorify in. That God, just like we glorify God, God is, as it were, glorified through us, through our righteousness. So this is really, really important verse here. And then it ends like this. Hakatan yeh elef, the smallest among you will be like 1,000. V'hatzair legoy atzum, and a young person will be like a whole nation. Ani Hashem, I am God. Be'ita achishena, in its time, I will hasten it. So the sages ask a classic question. What does it mean? And we've discussed this before, but this is the perfect time because here it is in the Haftarah. What does it mean? In its time, I will hasten it. So the sages said, it seems like a contradiction. If it's in its time, then it can't be hastened. It has its time, and that's when it's going to happen. And if it can be hastened, then it can happen at any time. Then it doesn't have a particular time. So the sages answer, if we merit, then it will be hastened. If we don't merit, it will come in its time. So it's not a contradiction. It's not a contradiction. But this is quoted all the time to tell us that in principle, Mashiach could come at any time. If we merit, Mashiach would come. That's why we have this tradition that in every generation there is an individual who is in potential, if the generation would merit it, they could be Mashiach. But if not, let's say, obviously, all these generations, millennium, we have not merited to bring Mashiach. But here we're guaranteed that there is a time, even if we don't merit it. There's much discussion about this, especially if we have to do tshuva in order for Mashiach to come. But here it's fairly clear that no matter what, there is a set time. Many people hold that it's year 6,000. That if we don't bring Mashiach before, when the year 6,000 comes, we begin the 7th millennium, and that is the Messianic era. That is the great Shabbat, like the 7th day. Let us hope that we merit it. And as we've discussed many times, we are in a redemptive process. Every day we get closer. So sometimes it seems that one step forward and two backwards. Other days it's two forward and one backward. Either way, the train has left the station. We're headed for redemption. May we merit it soon and in our days.